like to welcome Mr. Professor Gunther Kress, who came to speak to us today about the materiality of science.
Well, first of all, Michaela, thank you very, very much for arranging this. It's a great pleasure to be in Prague. Only the second time I've been here. I think the last time was 15 years ago when Prague was a slightly different kind of city. Well, I don't know yet, but it feels different. And of course, the university is an ancient and venerable institution, very famous, and so I feel honored to be able to speak here, even if it's in a new building. So what do I want to do? I want to present a few ideas around what I call, and other people call, to social semiotics, and then maybe focus a little bit on a particular issue which Michaela said might be interesting. How do we think about image and writing and the relation between image and writing? So that's what I'll do. Can I say, first of all, does anybody here have a problem understanding me or English? But if you do, please feel free to say, wait a minute, wait please, or can you repeat that? I mean, really, I think it would be, I'm always, I speak absolutely no Czech, unfortunately, whatsoever. That's my problem, and that's simply my life. I didn't get to learn it. Anyway, I'll start. So, meaning making. What does social semiotics aim to do, as against other kinds of semiotics? It aims to offer an encompassing account, that is, bring together, provide an account of all meanings made by members of a community using any of the modes, the means for making meaning, which are available in that community, in any of its social environments. An immediate consequence of having that approach of a single theory to deal with all meanings in any environment in a community is, an immediate consequence is that we can do away with all kinds of special kinds of semiotics. There is no visual semiotics because it's part of the normal means of making meaning. There is no semiotics of the theatre because that's part of what a social semiotic account would need to provide. We have a special kind of social environment. We have special genres that's called theatre and drama, and social semiotics attempts to account for all of these things. So no semiotics of advertising or of public relations. It is all encompassed in that single enterprise. And I think no semiotics of music. It is part of that. So it's a big area. It is fairly new. Much of it is unexplored. In relation to language, we in the West have at least 5,000 years of history of scholarly endeavor to understand what language is in its various forms. Social semiotics came about sort of about 40 years ago. So there's a bit of work to be done to catch up with all the work that's been done over 5,000 years in relation to language. But I think what is important that I can, within this one theory, bring together the different kinds of activities that people engage in when they make meaning. There are three things that I want to talk about, as I call them here, three strands, which are everywhere connected and yet are to some extent separate. Social semiotics, of course, deals with the social in time. The social in time, that is, it deals with history. So to some extent, social histories are one strand. Semiotic change, as we know, this is constant, and that's the second strand, and it accompanies the first one. It runs sort of in parallel to social history, the semiotic history. The two are connected, as I'll come to say. Semiotic change, both in the resources we have, so for instance in the resources for distributing meanings. I mean, this is a resource for distributing meanings in one way, the little machines that we have called mobile devices, phones, etc. Those are resources, but there are also resources as far as social semiotics is concerned, not just speech or writing or gesture or image or movement or any of the kinds of things, the making of three-dimensional entities. These are changing too, constantly. So semiotic change in the resources, that runs alongside. And it's only about, I would say, 20 years at most that people where I work in, let's say, an Anglophone environment are beginning to talk about multimodality. That hasn't been a term in the humanities and social sciences before then. So now we have to talk about a multiplicity of means for making meaning, and that's a semiotic change. It's a change in the semiotic landscape. And last, of course, and cannot be ignored, technological change. So, for instance, the sites where we make meanings have changed entirely from, say, a blackboard and chalk to a whiteboard and kind of pen to an interactive, digitally motivated whiteboard. Of course, to these little devices which all of us now have. I've noticed that now, if I'm sitting on the bus, a lot of people have two of them. One of them isn't enough. I don't know what you do with two, but the sites of making meaning and the sites for producing meaning, for disseminating meaning, receiving meaning, have changed totally. And of course, with the change in these sites has come a change in agency. Now, when I say that these strands are everywhere interwoven, why do I not talk about agency when I talk about social histories? I should be talking about it there. But the new technologies also have changed agencies enormously. They enable me to be a producer of meanings which I can multiply and disseminate and put into the world, which I couldn't do when I was a reader of a newspaper or a listener to a radio program or a watcher of television. So agency has been changed in social respects and, of course, also in technological aspects. And so these things can't be dealt with separately. I think they're always touching each other. One is affecting the other and the other. But I want to bring them together in one kind of in one talk. I'll have a brief and a very general introduction. I'll introduce some key concepts and terms in social semiotics. This is not an introduction to social semiotics in general, but only to some terms. And then I will focus on two modes in this wider semiotic landscape, namely writing and image. And by saying writing rather than language, I'm already saying that in my account of the world, speech and writing are distinct modes. So I'm training myself, I'm attempting to re-educate myself at a late stage in my life, not to use the term language, which is a bit strange, but anyway. But maybe if you were a user of Mandarin and you weren't therefore using an alphabetic means of documenting the kinds of things you want to mean, the relation between speech and writing that exists in alphabetic cultures doesn't exist there. And then suddenly you realize that there are two distinct means of making a meaning. One is the character-based system, which of course is now being changed, and the other, of course, is spoken Mandarin. So I want to say something quite similar happens in cultures that use the alphabet, except the seeming ease with which you can put speech into writing seeming ease, a deception really, makes us think as of these two things as one. And of course I want to say something about production and dissemination and a little bit about technologies and this question of agency, and if there is time at all, have a brief look, and only very briefly and not very far, into the future. What's the future going to be like? I now ask myself, what will it be like to be a social human, given the kinds of changes we are witnessing and developments we're witnessing now? Can we still speak of the social? A friend of mine who teaches in Brazil, she says that for her, her younger students, high school students, but also university students, don't use the term social media. I've never used it because I thought, which media are not social? There's different reasons for not using social media, but for them, the social is already a kind of a very nebulous concept. So, I wonder what's going to happen there. So far, in my thinking about meaning and semiotics, I've thought the social is prior. Yeah? The social meaning is made in action in social environments, in social interaction, in social action, and that's where meaning arises. Of course, we use semiotic means for making meaning, but meaning arises when I act with others in social environments, sometimes by myself. I'm still using social tools. I'm in a social environment, so meaning arises for me in the social. And I regard the semiotic as a kind of it's very difficult to find a term which isn't useless, but the semiotic is a kind of mirror of the social, which means that if you have a particular semiotic entity, whatever it might be a multimodal entity, it might be a kind of a post which you've put on Instagram, it might be a three-dimensional thing. I would say the semiotic allows you to make inferences about this, the social environment and the social agency in which it was constructed. So it goes two ways. The social is mirrored in the semiotic. From the semiotic you can kind of make inferences about the social in which this was constructed and the environments and the agency that was at work. So the social at the moment, the hesitation that I have is I cannot see how current developments in technologies will work in the future. And in England, in any case, Mrs. Thatcher, somebody who lived a long time ago, most of you won't remember the name, said in the 1980s, there is no such thing as society. It wasn't a prophecy, it was an attempt to make it happen. It was an attempt to unmake the social. And of course, that process has been carried on by neoliberal economy and by neoliberalism in general. So, and I think it's been amplified by the technologies which are around. Okay, but if I say the social is prior, and I say the mirror, the semiotic is a mirror of the social, I want to try it now. This is an example I use. I've been using in what used to be called the West, right? I assume that you have seen neither of these two images that I'm about to show. They didn't exist here, I think, but I thought, will I still show them? And I thought, yes, I will still show them, and I'll ask you a question, which is, when you look at these things, they are images of washing powder packages. Yeah, so there's a washing powder package. Is the Persil a recognized brand here?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. How long has Persil been here?
From the revolution, no? From the 89.
Okay. Okay.
I don't know exactly, but I think it started after the change before.
Right. This is yeah. That's why it's interesting in a sense, because I think hardly anybody here can have seen these because you're too young. but hardly anybody could have seen these because they didn't exist here then, probably. But I will nevertheless ask my question, which is the image which you see on the left here and the image you see on the right, whereabouts, at what period would you date the image on the left?
1930s.
1930s?
50s.
50s? Yeah? You haven't seen it before. 30s, 50s? I won't do a kind of a count, but and the image on the right?
Contemporary.
More recent.
Yeah.
Let's call it more recent. Yeah? Okay. Now, why? Why do we make these? Yes, there is the dress, but there's also something which is beyond the dress, namely this image comes from the late 1950s. Yeah? And at that time, the late 1940s. At that time, washing machines were the new technology to be brought into the home of those who could afford them. Nobody would have bought 5 or 6 washing machines as are lined up here, but in a sense it's the march of new technology coming into the family, into the house, into the household. The march of new technology, of course, has effects on what women, and we're talking about gender versions now, what women were doing in the house before the march of new technology, or with the march of new technology. We're talking about something which, in which the woman behind the one closest to us is wearing a dress which is not as white as it could be if you were using a washing machine and Persil washing powder. In other words, there was competition about whiteness and whatever. So there's gender coded into this. What a woman does, what a woman ought to be doing. There's technology coded into it. There's also other kinds of things. There's a use of writing, and there's a use of image. When you come to that, you notice immediately the color has changed. It's become somewhat more realist. That might be a matter of technologies of production, but what you also notice immediately is there is hardly any writing. Yeah, the meaning is being now taken over and displayed or kind of shown by image. The move has gone away from adults and from women, because now we know that women, of course, are not located only in the house. The move has been to children. So children are in focus. The children are active. They can jump into puddles. It doesn't matter, because at home there is one of these machines. At home there is a package of this washing powder. The two packages, which are about 40 years apart in terms of history and social history, show to those who kind of lived through that a change in the social environments, social structures in which people have lived, the technological structures in which people have lived, but they also show a change in the means for representation. Yeah? Here, writing seems important. That doesn't mean that most people will have read what's written here. Their writing has a very different function. It's no longer the central means of communication, nor is it a kind of equally important with image as it might be here. There's been a fundamental change in the uses of means for making meaning, from maybe the equal significance of image and writing to the centrality of image for making meaning. So that is what I mean by the semiotic being a mirror of the social. You can read off what kind of social this is about: the value of children, of activity, of freedom, of lack of restraint. A very different kind of child would have been portrayed here had there been children appearing here. So that's what I mean by the mirror. It's not an accurate mirror because, of course, all these things are, from a particular perspective, they are bearers of ideology, but there are mirrors nevertheless. So the constant question for a social semiotic approach is, what are the characteristics, what are the features of the social in which I make meaning, or somebody is making meaning which I kind of respond to and remake for myself. So what are the features of the social is the constant question underlying both the production of meaning, but also my remaking of meaning in response to a prompt that I get by somebody saying something to me, sending something to me, showing me something, and so on. Okay. I'll just say something about this notion of social change and semiotic consequences. Where I have spent all my life, there has been a fundamental change from the dominance of the state to the dominance of the market. Yeah, the state has kind of been deliberately sort of made smaller, destroyed, kind of diluted. The market has grown. In terms of identity, of course, it means in a society which is kind of shaped by the state, I'm a citizen, I have certain kinds of responsibilities, certain kinds of duties. In the market, I'm not a citizen, I'm a consumer. The consumer is a very different identity to the citizen. The citizen is moved by responsibilities and duties, and the consumer is moved by the possibility of choice, making the right choice in relation to what is available. So it's a fundamental change from the state to the market. I imagine that to some extent you've probably been witnessing this here for the last 20, 30 years. So that's fundamentally. I have spent the last 20 years of my life in institutional education. The problems which schools have is that the schools were designed to educate citizens. They were not ever designed to educate consumers. Children now come into school having been educated in the market to be consumers, making their own choices. The school says, no, there's no choice here, you do what I tell you. So that problem is most strongly felt in relation to schooling and the present young generations in the school. So the move has been one from social authority to individual agency, from an adherence to understood conventions, for instance, rules, or whatever they were, and grammar, to individual style. That is, style is the outcome of my choices in particular environments. A change from working with limited semiotic resources now to being able to use a multiplicity of semiotic resources. Even I'm an incompetent user of these devices, but I can make images, I can do all kinds of things which go well beyond the written word. So from a limited resource available to multiplicity of resources. So a limited resource said, are you competent in the use of that resource? The multiplicity of resources available says, do you have the capacity to design these resources in relation to the intentions or the wishes or desires you have? And so there's a move from competence to the capacity for design. That's a very different kind of positioning of an individual. The full capacity for multimodal design, where before we said, well, can you write an essay, or can you write a letter to your parents or something. Now these things have semiotic consequences, and that's what I'll sort of show. As far as technologies and resources for production and dissemination are concerned, well, the resources change from the centrality of language and the unchallenged sort of common sense assumption of the centrality of language, which you get in if you read the writings by famous semioticians like Umberto Eco or other people like Roman Jakobsen, the unquestioned assumption that language is kind of central and definitive of what it is to be a rational human being. So from that to a choice. Which modes shall I use in making the message I want to make to put my desires into the world? In terms of sites, a definite move from the page as part of what we would now call a platform, the book as platform or the journal as platform. I mean, only retrospectively, I never called the book a platform, but now I probably would. So from the page as dominant to the screen as dominant. And the page is very differently organized, has a very different history to the screen. The screen is its recent history, I suppose, is as having image as the dominant mode which appears there. Page as having had writing as the dominant mode which appeared there. In terms of production, the compositional principles in relation to pages and to screens have changed fundamentally. And I'll say something about that. From the page was roughly organized in terms of linearity, given of course by both the line itself, by the syntax which followed the line to some extent, but the screen, but also contemporary pages now in textbooks, for instance. You open a textbook and you get a two-page, a double-page kind of presentation of something. The present pages are beginning to be influenced by the organization of screens, and you have no longer kind of linearity but modularity. I'll say what that means. So I think there are enormous consequences for notions of identity. Who I think I am because of what I think I can do. Or rather what I'm required to be able to do in my normal everyday actions. So from competence in the use of rules to agency in rhetoric and design is what I think is going on there. Sometime in the late 80s, I had in my academic past, I had a longish period in something which was called critical discourse analysis, because in the early 90s, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, those of us who were young then thought society wasn't as it might be, it could be changed, if only we could sort of point to the appearance of power and the way power was shaping our lives. And so we kind of did critical linguistics, some people did critical sociology, others did critical philosophy. Everybody was being critical because we thought that by being critical, but critique would bring the existing situation into crisis. By the late 1980s, I thought actually the world is in crisis, not because of what we did. That was really a marginal effect. The world was in crisis, so wouldn't it be better, especially if you were then, as I began to be, in educational institutions, to focus on design and not give young people tools for providing critiques of their world, things which have already happened and been done, but rather enable them to design their world in relation to their own wishes. How do you use the tools which you have to bring your desires into the world? So design is prospective, whereas critique was, of course, retrospective. Critique always looked at the actions of usually more powerful others. Design says you have the capacity to put your interests into the world through means of design. So I said here design brings features and resources into a coherent composition. Composing, of course, being crucial still. The rhetor's and designer's interest, and I'll say something about interest, in what is to be designed. Something is to be designed. How do I best do it? What resources do I have? And of course, whom am I designing for? What are the characteristics of the audience for whom I'm designing? So design is a mediating process. It gives shape to the rhetor's and designer's interest and purpose in relation to an imagined audience, using available semiotic resources to materialize the rhetor's purposes as a shaped sign complex. So saying I've got meanings, I've got the capacity to design, I've got several kinds of resources here. I know what the audience is like. They're 8 years old in a school setting. How will I use my resources in order to get across to them what I think they might be interested in, or maybe it would be useful for them to know. So the processes of design are always realized in material objects, and of course a text is also a material object, but also realized in practices. So for me, the fundamental underlying process is that of design. I am agentive. I understand what these different resources offer. I can put them together in relation to what I wish to do with somebody who's kind of here listening to me, or whom I want to convince, or I want to write a textbook on, or something else that I want to do, whatever it might do. I design these things. I'm agentive. I can do that. Of course, all of that I would want to happen in an ethical frame, where I would say, what I do in terms of design and being active and agentive ought not to be to the detriment of those who are around me. Okay, so just two examples of how the social is mirrored in the semiotic. So for instance, I think that notions of order and authority will tend towards linearity, because linearity doesn't offer a choice as to where I will start reading, where I will begin, and where I will finish. Whereas the notion of choice, which is what the neoliberal capitalist market says it's offering, goes to modularity. It says, look, this is my supermarket here. It's got several aisles, and I've got breakfast cereals here, and I've got washing powders over there, and I've got meat there. You can start where you want. And the breakfast, I had an experience many years ago, one of my first visits to the United States, and somebody took me to a supermarket, and there was a Walmart. There was a passage, I would say 20 meters long, with breakfast cereals on either side. Yeah? So actually, a lot of work to kind of say, well, how will I make a choice about breakfast cereals? But the idea is that you at least are given the appearance of choice. But it's modular. There's no saying, look, you must get the breakfast cereals before you get your vegetables or whatever. Now, so that's one thing. The authority and order is against choice. That kind of distinction will have its effects in the semiotic entities which are produced, and will be visible there and can be read then from there. The Walmart supermarket, says to me, look, we're not forcing you into anything. Up to you. The stability of the social, I think, is reflected in the canonicity of modes. If you want to write, these are the rules of grammar. If you want to write a letter, this is how you use the rules of grammar. If you write a report of some kind, these are rules of genre which you use. The stability. And you have to understand these. And there are canonical modes. You don't write to your boss with an email, or you don't address your boss via Instagram. No, there's the rules about what you can and can't do. There are stable genres. There's a clear materialization of how cohesion is to be affected and coherence. Whereas in a provisional social, the social where I'm just an individual, I don't quite know what I'm going to do. I happened to be going home on the bus, the London double-decker bus, and a free paper was on the seat next to me from a supermarket in London, Waitrose. And it said that there is now a big change in the organization of supermarkets, from the very big supermarkets to very small ones. The reason being that actually the younger generation, this is people below the age of 30, young professionals, don't shop once a week. When they leave in the morning, they don't know what they're going to eat in the evening. They want to be free. They want to be kind of, we're just... so provisionality is a kind of a new principle of the is it an organizing principle? It's a feature of the social, and of course it means that at some time in the afternoon I have to give 5 minutes to kind of making a decision about what I'll shop, and I would call that a rhetorical decision as well. And I will design my trip to the local, smaller kind of supermarket which already sells me ready-made meals I don't have to cook. So it's about that change from the stability to the provisionality and what effects it has. Okay. Now we come to, this was by way of introduction. Now we come to some stuff about social semiotics. The term in semiotics, the key term in semiotics of it, whatever kind, is of course the sign. And in social semiotics, the assumption is that we do not use signs, we make signs. Every sign is newly made. That would be the assumption. And every sign is newly made on the basis of my interest, and not interest in a kind of a superficial sense, a facile sense, but rather interest as the condensation and focus of the experiences I have had in my life, which I've kind of made into a relatively coherent, integrated entity in my head, which come to a point of focus at a particular moment. I've got to make a decision about what I'm going to eat tonight. So interest in that sense. I quite like fish. I quite like. Actually, I don't like pizza. And so my experiences in my life are kind of focused. I mean by interest, the sum total of my experiences shaped constantly and integrated constantly, and attempt at their coherence brought to bear at a particular moment in relation to the decision I have to make. The decision might be to shop, to make a sign, to make something. Then, of course, crucially, in social semiotics, this notion of modes. Modes as an alternative to using the term language in ever more metaphorical and ever more weakly metaphorical ways. And of course, then saying something about how do we talk about modes? What can writing do that image can't? What can image do that writing can't? What can I do with gesture that kind of can't be done with either speech or writing? Those kinds of questions. And then the question of multimodality, because in social semiotics the assumption is that most of the entities which I make and design are multimodal. They are the result of bringing certain kinds of things together as the basis of my decision that for this kind of purpose I better bring these together on this occasion. So I orchestrate things, much in the sense of an orchestral kind of orchestration to make these complexes. And of course, is it the case that different modes simply repeat what each does, or do they have different kinds of affordances? And of course, do they also orient me differently in the world? Epistemologically, certainly, but maybe ontologically also. And two terms here, which are becoming, I think, very crucial in that. How do I move meaning from this mode to that mode? How can I compare them? And of course, what happens when I transform things? In other words, constant change from mode to mode, constant change within mode. How do I handle that phenomenon? So, an example which I've used for a long time is this here. My personal experience, which was the kind of enlightened sort of lightning strike. Our then 3-year-old saying, "Dad, I want to draw." My children had the habit of making their kind of workshops or offices in my office at home, and so I said okay, and so the 3-year-old sits on my lap and gets a pen and has a bit of paper and draws and says, "This is a wheel, this is a funny wheel, there's another wheel, there's a wheel," and when he's made all these wheels he says, "This is a car." And I thought, okay, didn't think much more about it. He was happy, he went off and did something else. This is a car. So he made wheels. He said, "This is a wheel." Yes, a circular entity, a signifier, a circular form, seems to be capable of representing a circular thing called a wheel. That to me is an apt, a motivated sign. Circle being a motivated means for representing wheel. But of course, if you're a 3-year-old and you walk around the family car, which at that time was a VW, what do they call the smaller ones, whatever it was. If you walk around the car, as you walk around the car, you see more and more wheels. I mean, so there's a kind of a decision to say, well, 7 wheels must be enough for a car. So many wheels is a car. A circle is a wheel, many wheels is a car. The process of analogy, this is like that, and out of that I make a sign which is then a metaphor. Yeah? And of course, many wheels is a car is also a metaphor for car. It probably includes the steering wheel, who knows. That as a principle has been for me an eye-opener, that in fact everything we do is the making of a new sign on the principle of what is criterial for me at this moment. Criterial for car at this moment for the 3-year-old was wheelness. That's criterial. The next moment or the next day something else might have been criterial for his younger sister. Later on, when she and her friends made cars, they were very different cars. They were kind of pillows on the floor and kind of drawers from the cupboard, and they kind of put down, and you kind of sat comfortably and talked. They were sort of social sites for social interaction. But the point was criteriality for the making of a sign. You might say, well, this is childish, and I make a distinction between being childlike and childish. Here is another drawing. For some years now, more than 10, I've been associated with somebody who started at that time was engaged in the training of surgeons at one of the teaching hospitals in London. And one day he came into my office and said, I hear you're a semiotician. I'm very interested in knowing whether you would be interested in looking at the operating theatre and looking at how I can kind of make simulated centres in which we can teach things. And so I said yes. And this comes from a long period there, and a colleague of mine, Jeff Bessemer, who worked in that site then for after a while for 2 years, happened on one occasion watch 2 surgeons who were about to go into the operating theatre to conduct an operation. But before they went in, they kind of talked about, they were not quite clear what they would find when they would kind of open the patient's body. And so you can see here, I think you can, can't you, the head of the patient, down here, the feet of the patient, yeah? Feet of the patient down there, head of the patient up there, and then you can see the windpipe bifurcating to go into the lungs. Yeah? Can you get the idea? When I first saw it, and when Jeff first saw it, we didn't know what it meant. I happened to use this drawing with a class of surgeons who were doing a Masters of Education in Surgical Education, and they immediately saw what this was. The point about the fact that they immediately saw what this was that, of course, you make these things within a particular community. They have a meaning in a community. They don't have a meaning, as it were, in a vacuum, in any kind of setting, but in this community, these kinds of things are known, as they would have been for the 3-year-old had he thought about how do I make a best drawing for my other 3-year-old friends in the neighborhood. It's quite specific, and of course they're saying the squiggly thing there is where they suspect the tumor to be in the person's lung. This happens, they've been talking about it. They talked about it. What are we going to find? And talking didn't quite suffice for them to locate what the problem or where the problem would be and what it would be like. So they got a bit of paper, just like you can't see, it's a raggedy piece of paper. Somebody had a pen and they started drawing. So they used, speech wasn't sufficient, they used the mode of drawing to localize, to make it, you would say this isn't precise, but for them it was precise enough to localize it and to kind of show what they were going to do. And this group of 25 surgeons in this class immediately saw, and they felt it talking. They kind of talked to each other about, what's this operation going to be like. So the point is, the sign, this is a newly made sign. You'll have never seen this before. I had never seen it before. Nobody will ever make this again in this way. It's a newly made sign. It is specific to the concerns of a particular community which has certain kinds of understandings, and that would be for me an absolute characteristic of the sign always made. Then they left it outside. This is why Jeff could pick it up. They went in and conducted the operation. So whether 3 years old or 30 years old, the process of sign making is quite similar in terms of principles, but of course it differs very much in terms of what is the sign about and what kind of detail do we need. So I'm saying here that for signs, for me signs are always motivated. I know Saussure said famously that the sign is an arbitrary and conventional relation of form and meaning, or whatever he said. Well, sometimes very, very important and very clever people get things completely wrong, and I think signs are not arbitrary connections of form and meaning, but they are motivated conjunctions of formal material entities and the meanings which are going to be expressed through them. So the sign maker's interest, it's about criteriality. The sign maker's interest is decisive about that which is taken as criterial. Criteria about that which is represented. So here, that which was to be represented was the tumour, which they suspected was on the left side of this patient's lungs. In the moment of sign making, the signified is that which is criteria for the sign maker. For them, what was to be signified was it's really important that we know where to look when we kind of open this patient's body, have some kind of idea. And interest encompasses both that which is to be represented, how does my interest shape or select that, and of course the assumed audience of the sign. In the case of the surgeon's drawing, the assumed audience were the two people acting together in making that drawing. The signifier is an existing material entity. Well, here they made the material entity regarded as apt for the signified. So the relation for me between signifier and the material thing and signified the not material thing is aptness. Not arbitrariness, but aptness. And because it's apt, when I see a sign, I can make inferences about, okay, this thing is apt for that. I can hypothesize that the meaning must be whatever something else is. Okay. So the process of deciding on aptness is that of analogy. The sign is therefore always a metaphor. So in making the sign, the motivated sign, there's my interest, which is the condensation at a particular moment of all of my experiences in relation to what I need to do now. And of course I do that in a community, or brings together the communities in which I've been, now a specific community. But because I make these signs, always, here the signs were made both in speech and in drawing, in the surgeon's sign, it affects what the mode of drawing can become. So the mode of each mode is constantly being reshaped by its uses in a particular, in the making of a particular. The speech is being changed here, drawing is being changed, and these image-like representations. In making signs constantly and newly, we collectively make modes. The mode of image, the mode of speech, the mode of writing. So we are the makers of the resources which are then available for others to use, including us. I call all of that semiotic work. I call it semiotic work because work implies seriousness and interest and intentionality. And it's difficult to say, yes, I can see you've done a lot of work, but it's useless, it's worthless. I have to sort of attempt to find the worth, the value in the work somebody has done. Okay. So modes are material resources, material in the sense that writing, inscription on a surface is material, speech is material, in the sound is kind of expansion and rarefaction socially shaped and culturally given for making meaning. Modes have affordances, potentials and limitations for making meaning, and they have logics, either temporal and sequential or spatial and simultaneous, and they affect the compositional principles of multimodal complexes. And I'm saying here that all modes are partial in reach and scope, and I hope to show you what I mean by that. So here, I like banal examples. And I've used this before, and some of you may have seen it if you've seen what I write. Waitrose, one of the supermarkets that I just mentioned, on my way to work, on top of the double-decker bus, the bus comes to a stop before some traffic lights, and about 150 meters before, on each side, there's a sign that says, if to the drivers of cars, this is the way to get into our car park, and this is the way to get into our car park. Yeah? So it's a very busy intersection, a very big road, and two big roads intersecting. If the sign were in writing alone, it couldn't work, yeah? Because before the driver had a chance to read the sign, traffic lights would have changed. It would have been, a mess. So the signs make use of three modes, of writing, of image, and of color. And both signs make use of the same three modes, writing, image, color, but they use different color schemes. They use different styles of drawing. They use different fonts. So you bring three modes together, one to kind of provide coherence in terms of background. One here, you can't quite see, there's a red line going through which says follow this, basically this imagined red line, and you'll come into our car park. This one has a similar, it's got a yellow line. So color is used for indicating direction, but also for giving coherence to the whole thing. Writing is used for naming certain kinds of things. Image is used for giving you a sense of location, and the three are used together to make a single completed thing. But for me, the important thing is that, yes, image shows and writing tells, and color highlights and provides coherence, but the important thing for me is that each mode is only ever partial in what it can do. Yeah? It's not the case, as has so long been said in semiotics, but also in other kinds of areas, that language, the finest human achievement, defining of our rationality, blah, 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 can do everything that we want. No, it can't, actually. There are limits to what you can do with speech, there are limits to what you can do with writing, and those two are different, because speech has different kinds of affordances to writing, some shared. So the partiality is what's important, but here you have a multimodal complex which has been designed. And when I say designed, I'll ask you another question, which some of you may know maybe from having spent time in London. Which of the two supermarkets would you prefer? Pardon?
Waitrose.
Because you know it?
No, because it's I don't know, it feels more...
Okay, now we would have a question. What is it that your feeling is based on? Yeah, is it the color? Do you prefer that kind of green and yellow to the deep blue and red? Do you prefer the style of font to that style of font? Do you prefer the drawing style of this here to the drawing style? Yeah. In other words, there are stylistic choices to be made in these two things. There's a stylistic choice to be made about color. Which do you think? We won't make a judgment about you and class. Of course, there's no class in your society, but which would be, do you think, the preferred supermarket for a working class mum or dad? Or which for a middle class mum or dad? Pardon? This one? For middle class? Really? Okay. Now, you and your friend in the front would have to sort of sit down and have a little seminar about your decisions. about colour and what colour means, about font and what font means, what drawing styles mean. And this is my characterization of this supermarket is at the checkout, when the little one has taken some chocolates from, there's always the chocolates reachable for the kids to kind of put in. Mum says, Samantha, we don't do that sort of thing. Yeah? Whereas there, the mother gives Samantha or a smack on the bottom. Put that back. On the whole, this is kind of solidly middle class. On the whole, in England, that is not solidly middle class, although they have the better selection of wines, which is a strange thing. Now, when I say in England, this morning it was last night, I got a shock in the room where I am lodging in this very nice guest house, university guest house in the middle of town. I looked in the bathroom, I thought, why have they put a chocolate bar in the bathroom? Because there's a sort of chocolate bar which is in white plastic with a kind of chocolatey kind of decorations on it, and I thought it's a chocolate bar. So I looked at it closely, and then it said hotel soap. But for me, the colour scheme said, this is for you to eat. Anyway, these things are culturally specific. Now, so these are not in time, but partial in what they can do. I want to show you a very brief example of something that is in time, but it's not in time here, and it is part of an interview conducted by colleagues of my friend Jeff Nezimer and myself. Colleagues, interviews for job interviews, where somebody's applied for a job, and here Pippa, the woman who's applying for the job, she's done that job but on a part-time contract. Now the job is being made full-time and she's applying for the contract. She wants to get the job. She's very keen to get it. The little bit of speech that goes on, somebody has said the person who's going to be the line manager, the human resources manager has said, what has changed about the job you've been doing? And Pippa says, the walks have doubled. And he responds, some. Now I'll show you the picture. So imagine this with the speech going on. This person has said, what's changed about the job? The person over there says to her, what's changed about the job? She says, the walks have doubled. He says, some. The moment he says some, he looks back at the paper, so she can't kind of respond to him. This is the person who will be the line manager of the person who gets the job. So my question now is, she doesn't have much power there. So how can she kind of make herself kind of significant? What are the means that she can use? She says the walks have doubled. Now she uses a gesture. She lands the gesture on the table in front of her, and she holds it while she fixes the person who will be the line manager for a long time. Yeah? Gesture is a means she's using. The length in which she holds the gesture is a means she's using. The longer it takes strength to hold the gesture there for a long time, and the gaze at the same time. It's not speech so much, but rather it's the other means. In speech, you would have to say something which this person here might take as offensive, because she's the powerless person, he's the powerful person. But he can hardly object to a gesture, and he probably can't object to her holding the gaze for a long time. So in this multimodal kind of orchestration here, she uses the modes which are least likely to cause a problem for her, and most likely to actually allow her to make the point of that she wants to make. Yeah. So that's how I would sort of go about it. What can gesture do here? What can gaze do here? that speech couldn't really do. So in this complex, that's how I would do the analysis. She did get the job, by the way. Okay. So that's something about it. You can do different kinds of things because gesture is less policed, as it were, in Bakhtin's terms, than, say, for instance, speech, and so nor is gaze. Although in some cultures, of course, gazing at somebody is impolite and can lead to problems. For instance, in Australia, Aboriginal children have been told not to gaze at adults because that's impolite. When they're in school, in a Western school, they don't look at the teacher. The teacher says, they never attend to me. They never look at me. And so these things are very specific. Now, I said earlier that modes have also epistemological or ontological consequences. And here is an example from a research project I did with a person who was Professor of Science Education over 3 years. How is science taught to 13, 14-year-olds, classes of women? And we did this over 3 years, and this one instance stuck out for me. After 4 lessons on how do you define a cell, or how do you discover what a cell is, and how do you know what it does, with examples, the onion skin, kind of you pull the thinner, stain it and look at it under the microscope, lots of drawings, lots of talk. In the 4th lesson, the teacher says, can somebody tell me something about cells? And a young woman speaks up and she says, a cell has a nucleus. Yeah? The cell, nominal entity, a verb of possession, nominal entity. And the teacher says, Sue, can you come out and draw it on the board? And Sue comes out and she draws that on the board. Yeah? Now my question is that the same knowledge as a cell has a nucleus? Yeah? Or rather, what kind of question does image respond to compared to speech? In speech you have to say something which is sentence-like. You have to have a nominal entity, a verbal entity, maybe another nominal entity. In drawing you have to locate things in relation to other kinds of things. Yeah? And epistemologically, if you're the teacher and you put that dot there as a marker where the nucleus is, the children will kind of copy it and say that is the truth. There's a commitment. Each mode makes a commitment. A cell has a nucleus, and here the commitment is a visual one. But epistemologically, and maybe ontologically, you're talking in a very different way about what seems to be the same kind of knowledge. So the shift between modes is not without quite profound consequences. And of course, in this notion of remaking meaning, there is transformation. For me, transformation is when you're in the same mode, you can change something. You can change, a report to some kind of a diary to a report, or a narrative to a report. A transduction is what you've seen here. The transduction from speech to image. So this question of how do we capture in a multimodal semiotic world, how do we capture the meaning which has been made? And a colleague of mine, Kate McCowan, has worked for a long time in preschool settings. She's now finished her PhD and she's doing research. And here you've got a situation where 2 kids, boy and girl, kind of are playing a game, posting things, but posting not a literal kind of material thing, but using a computer to post, a ring into a ring, or a triangle into a triangle, etc. And so how do you capture what meaning is being made here when there is action, when there is speech, when there is gaze, because you can see the children turn to each other and talk to each other? What do we do? That's the big question. What are the appropriate means of kind of documenting what goes on, documenting first of all, and maybe then documenting it in a form which allows you then to analyze what meanings are being made. And this is another one of Kate Cowan's documentation. So the kids in a preschool setting are allowed to go in the garden if it's fine and run around. They run around, and so here 3 children, 3 boys, I think they're 4 years old, run around. They have a game of chasing. Now, is a game of chasing meaningful? Yeah, is a game of chasing meaningful? Is it something which is, some teachers say, oh, they're kind of running around again, and others say, no, they're working out who's boss and how do you become boss and what do you do, and the rules of the game. So Kate says, how can I document this as a meaningful event? And so she traces, of course, the path that the children have taken in running, and you'll see that she has spaced the arrows differently. So as the children speed up in their running, the arrows are further apart. Yeah? As the children are slowing down, the arrows are closer together. So the arrows measure the same period of time. The same period of time allows you to cover more ground when you're fast and less ground when you... And so you can actually track the pace at which these people are going and who's winning and who's doing what. And then she can, because she's got a microphone operating there, she can hear what they're saying, and you bring all that together, and you discover suddenly that one of these young men, these boys, 4-year-old, actually seems to be the boss. He kind of does it, and the others attempt by different means within the game to interrupt what he's able to do. So here, I think, I would say what you're using is apt means of documenting what's going on, and of course these apt means are highly metaphoric. Yeah? So pace indicated by distance covered, different actors by different colors, and so forth. So the process of, in a multimodal kind of semiotic world, the process of documenting what goes on requires a whole rethinking of what we used to easily call transcription. Okay. All right, then 2 modes in this wider semiotic landscape, writing an image. A little bit of history. How old is this newspaper? 150. 150? Okay. This paper is from 1958. 1958. Again, I want you to think about identity. What does it require to be a reader of that paper? Yeah? How much time would you spend? What kind of energy do you kind of have to have a class? What is it to be a reader of that? I use that example because in 1998 I was asked to give a talk about, I don't know, probably writing, and historically the times had changed. From these small things, impossible nearly to read, to this, not just image but color. Yeah? At that time, a German newspaper, which had also tracked the Frankfurt Allgemeine, still had no images, was just kind of black and white and blah. Okay, bit more history. A book from the 1920s, an information book for young boys, probably between the ages of 8 and 11, called The Boy Electrician. Mr. Sims, who was the author, said this book is meant for these children who play with electricity so that it won't kill themselves when they make a bell or when they make something else. This is 1926, I think. The copy I bought was republished in 1946. Information books in the 1990s looked like this. Yeah? So the point I'm trying to make here is a fundamental change in the uses of writing an image, but not as a consequence of the appearance of the internet. So there are social changes which are going on, which are having an effect in some way. And if I said to you, which is central here, image or writing, what would you say? Image.
It's what captures the attention.
What captures the attention. I have to confess, this is a Dorling and Kindersley book, they were famous in the 1990s. I first read these things. because, obviously I'm trained to read, not to kind of look at it, picture books, but it's probably sort of evenly divided. But if you had a young reader, it's most likely that she would go to, or he would go to, yeah? So, an enormous shift, but not under the influence of the technology of, digitization or the internet. And here is a different example, again from image and writing. A colleague of mine did some research in a primary school classroom, 7-year-old children on the other side of the river, the south of the river. And one day the teachers, they all went to the British Museum. On the day when they came back, the teacher said, "I'd like you to write me a story and draw me a picture of our visit to the museum." So here is one story. When I got to the museum, it looked bigger than I thought. When I went in, I took off my coat and went into the men's toilet. And after I ran upstairs, I went into the lift. Then I went to see the mummies and all this stuff. Then we went to our cloakroom so we can get our coat, and then we went to Waterloo Station on the tube, and a train to Clapham Junction, and walked back to school and went home very happy. And I told my mum, sister, and my brother at the end. At the age of 7, it's more or less spoken English transcribed into writing, hence these sentences. Okay, now the image. Yeah? So you can see the interest in the mummies and all this stuff. You can see the size of the museum, but I think you can also see a very different kind of attention brought about by, or recollection brought about by, the means through which you make your representation. Yeah, and if I was saying about these two modes asking different kinds of questions, I would say this mode here asks what events in what sequence. Whereas this mode here, I think, asks what salient entities in what relation. Yeah, I think that's a fundamental change in how we approach the world and how we then represent the world. So it isn't simply that, oh, that's a nice drawing and that's a nice story, but rather something very different goes on. And of course, when you go to a bit later on, that might, I'll show you a bit in a while, just a similar kind of thing. So here, a bit of writing which is from a magazine, reporting on one of these cooking competitions on television, and the person who won, a man called Stephen Wallace, made a salad of dandelion, jamon iberico, de bellota, poached quail's egg with walnut vinaigrette. Very nice. And he says, he's transcribed here, "I conceived this dish to bring some humour to my experience of the final. The dish evokes a deep sense of the countryside and is full of very grown-up flavours, despite the nursery-esque coziness of bacon and eggs." So have you got a sense of what this dish is? That's what it looked like. Yeah. So the question is, how much of that can you do in writing? How much can you not do in writing? Or if you have only that, what is missing? So I think those would be my ways of sort of working my way into affordance and potentials of these two modes. And so here you have just the heading of something and that's something else, which is very common. So in other words, the relation between writing and image is subject to change, depends on the environment, what you want to do, but of course is subject to a continuous change, hence my showing you the Times newspaper front page from 1958 and from 1998, the two information books for young boys, and this here. Here you have, I don't know, is anybody here familiar with the novelist, the German, or Anglo-German novelist Sebald? No? Sebald is in a sense, he's roughly my age. Well, he's not my age because he died 15 years ago. But he exiled himself to England and wrote a lot about an attempted account to understand what happened in Nazi Germany in relation to the Jewish population, but of course other people as well. But in his novels, he often has, this is The Rings of Saturn, he often has images in there. And the question is, why does he, it's become a sort of a little bit of an industry in literary studies, but why does Sebald put that image? What can the image here do? His narratives are very finely spun. They're very kind of, they're gossamer light. It's not a sledgehammer saying, you know, these things are awful that happened in Nazi Germany. It's gossamer light. And then here he sits on the east coast of England in Sussex and looks out over the sea and reminisces about a battle that happened there in the 17th century, a sea battle. So what does a novelist want to do when for him words are not enough? Or do you know the writings of Orhan Pamuk? What is, I mean, Istanbul is a biography of his native city, but what do the images do in the novel Istanbul, written here? What has and what has made it possible over the last 20 or 30 years to put images into the novel? What can this convey that can't convey? You know, the image is against the writing. So those are the kinds of questions I have. But another, Dorling and Kind, the publishers of the other book on reptiles, a book on Istanbul is very different. Here writing dominates because it has a different function. Here the function of writing is different to the function of writing there, both about the city of Istanbul. So I would say always, what is being done, what is intended to do, what can one mode do that the other can't, and so of course in a travel guide writing has a very different function to image. And lastly, this example here. I did with my colleague Jeff Bessemer a big research project on textbooks between the period of the 1930s to the year 2000. Textbooks. How have they changed? Because there's been this big cultural pessimism. You know, writing is disappearing. Nobody can write. Culture is going down. Down the plug. And I wanted to know what actually is being changed, and are there gains in the change from writing to image? Are there possible gains? So here is a science textbook. It's for 13-year-olds on magnetism. It has illustrations. In fact, a reviewer of the book in the 1930s said the book will be very popular with boys because of the many illustrations. So, but by 1989, a similar kind of topic, a 2-page spread, looks like this. The curricular content has gone from writing here to image. If you read what is written here, you won't get any idea about what circuits are like. Yeah, the curricular content is now represented in image. The other thing that has happened when I said there's a 2-page spread normally, this book is organized in chapters. The principle about what is a chapter is what is sufficient to explain the content which I want to deal with. In the 2-page spread, you have 2 pages to kind of limit the content that you can give. But the main thing is here, the curricular content is in image. Can you still do abstraction in image? Yes, you can. You can have these abstract diagrams. They can be, and then you can have these pseudo-realist representations. Yes, you can abstract. That's not a problem. But the forms of abstraction are different in image than they are in writing. Again, the question is, what is it I want to do, and does this mode allow me to do it? The other thing here, I think image is meant in the terms of Roland Barthes, I think more or less to illustrate. Here the image is no longer meant to illustrate. I want to draw attention to something else which is specifically about writing, which is what are the entities of writing? What are the entities of writing? Well, words, let's say, maybe sentences, maybe paragraphs, maybe the chapter, or the chapter is defined by content. So let's look at two sentences from here to there. In the 1936 book, a typical sentence is, and I don't know whether your linguistics is good enough, when you find a verb form, you have a sub-sentence. Yeah? So here you have, when a current is passed through the coil in the direction indicated in the figure, we can show by applying Fleming's left-hand rule that the left-hand side of the coil will tend to move down and the right-hand side to move up. There are 7 sub-sentences in a complex sentence. Yeah? Because the topic is complex, the sentence has to be complex. Here, sorry. Sorry. The second extract is from that book here, 1989. 50 years difference, roughly. In this book, let's see how big the sentences are. In your first circuit, you used torch bulbs joined with wires, 2. Modern electric equipment uses the same basic ideas. If you look inside a computer, there are not many torch bulbs or wires. The wires and bulbs have been replaced by electronic devices like transistors, chips, and light-emitting diodes. There is no sentence that has more than 2 sub-sentences. Yeah, there's been an enormous simplification. Now, what does that simplification mean? Is it sufficient for cultural critics to say the world is kind of falling apart, culture is going down the plug hole, or could it be the case that some of what is no longer being said in writing and in the form of sentences now being said in image, and the kind of, in other words, you have a conjunction of, you have a different kind of complexity. Yes, writing has become much simpler. It's become much simpler also under the pressure of, under social pressure, because girls were not interested in science, most boys weren't interested in science, you have to make it simpler, but also because with image, you now have a new complexity. How do I put image and writing together and make a complex whole out of these things? Here is the website called the Poetry Archive from 2005, I think. And I want to show you just this is addressed to adults who are interested in poetry, including teachers, for instance, but also to children between the ages of 8 and 12. So this is about, this is an introduction to the website as a whole. You know, a lot of writing as we recognize it. Here is the introduction to the part for children. Yeah. So when I talked about modularity before, as against linearity, this I think is linear. Yeah. This is modular. This tells you where you start, where you go, and where you finish. This says what interests you most. And whatever interests you most, well, why don't you start there? Yeah, it is what I said about the neoliberal kind of supermarket, or the neoliberal. It says you are the person who chooses, and according to your choice, you will kind of enter this and go further in it. So that's, I think, a fundamental difference. Of course, other questions arise here. Coherence and cohesion would still be done linguistically. Here, coherence and cohesion is done probably by a color scheme. Yeah, a notion that this kind of color scheme would be attractive to 8 to 12-year-olds who are interested in poetry rather than football. So those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about in the move of writing and image in relation to each other. What is happening here, and how is this all playing out? Here is a restaurant from Sao Paulo, just in case you go there. I was told it was very nice, and it was very nice. And I'm looking at how is writing an image used in the website this restaurant uses to advertise itself. So here's an opening page. What's it called? Lemongrass for a Thai restaurant, to sort of make it look clean, attractive, and fresh, and whatever. And then a kind of thing which you recognize from certain kinds of websites, yeah? Instagram, Pinterest, whatever it might be. The organization is different. The main means of attraction is image and organization of image. Of course, you have these images here with bits of writing next to them, and here, for instance, in this thing, you have writing here about this dessert, but it's image-led. And so the epistemological positioning both of the information there and of visitor is in terms of given. Given is the dessert which you no doubt will wanted to have, and then a little bit of information about the... so again, the sort of what is going to be useful for most, and that is, I think, the contemporary. She is the head chef of the restaurant, and I've just played with that because here, this what is here is given, that is what we take for granted, and here we get some information about it. But if you switch that around, I wonder whether it is still the same kind of thing. This is given, and this is new. I think it has changed the significance of the element on the right and on the left, depending on the positioning on the page. So in other words, layout is figuring as a kind of substitute for syntax. It's not that there isn't kind of ordering or a kind of grammar, but the grammatical means or syntactic means are different. Okay, I'll now rush through the last bit, and I'll just say what happens when we look at the history of the so-called new or social media. Yeah? Facebook introduced in 2004, YouTube introduced in 2005, Pinterest in 2010, Snapchat in 2011, a very rapid kind of history, and of course it pays to track what social change is being met by the changes in the application, the apps, and of course what semiotic change accompanies the social change. What is driving what? Here's an old-fashioned blog. Did some research with a colleague, Mia Domingo, on blogs, two different kinds of blogs. So WordPress is the platform, photographs there, color there, writing there. Again, a WordPress, same kind of topic, family and food. This one is called the Frugal Family. This is called Thinly Spread. You can see same resources but different style. Yeah, I think very different style. WordPress. So that's the past. I mean, this is archaic. Here a little bit. I couldn't get a Pinterest kind of thing, so that I took it from this internet. Very little writing. The identity which is being addressed is addressed by what image can offer in terms of color, kind of image, etc. Same kind of thing here. Image by itself used to establish identity. Twitter. Okay. What is the future of writing on Twitter? So Twitter, of course, uses, among other things, links. Now, a big question on for me, is a link writing, or is it something else? Is it writing? Does it have words? No. Yeah. So in other words, these things are becoming the boundaries, the borders that were kind of absolutely clear. I think are. This is a surgeon tweeting. So Twitter isn't just for politicians or Mr. Trump, but other more serious, even more serious than Mr. Trump. And now I've come to prospects, and I use the term from that research project that I had used with my colleague Jeff Bezemer, gains and losses. Looking into the future, what might be gained and what might be lost. I'm looking at Snapchat. Right? In Snapchat, as you know, Snapchat you upload, you post things to it, you upload stuff onto Snapchat, and Snapchat has an algorithm which organizes it into what it calls a story. Yeah? That's what it does. It does it for you. Now, what is changing, of course, is a notion of story. What is the story? So it's just organized by an algorithm. And of course, at the end of the day, it's gone. Yeah? At the end of the day, the Snapchat disappears. So, is it? I called it really. Is this the elimination of history? Because Snapchat doesn't. Facebook has an archive. You can go back in the archive and see what people have posted and what you've done and blah. Snapchat doesn't have an archive. And also there's a new ordering of image and writing. No longer are they kind of conjointly there, as they were in the website of the restaurant or in the blog of the families that blogged on food and family. Here, image is the basis. And writing is a kind of a superposition on image. Either done by hand as a kind of a doodle, as in this one here, or in other kinds of ways. But image is the basis. And you can kind of superimpose bits of writing onto it. So that's very different. The other thing, of course, is with Snapchat, as with these other this device here, you can produce selfies. Yeah, a selfie. And I think now it comes to the question of the camera, as we knew, always, the old camera that Japanese tourists wear around their neck, faces to the front. They're a kind of prosthetic eye. They look for me into the world, as this one does too. I, as an individual agent, look into the world and I make a recording of what I see. But what happens when the front-facing camera faces me? Is it still a front-facing camera? Yeah, I mean, this thing can turn around, and now it says the front is where I face, where I face is you, me. What has happened to the front-facing camera? Is it the case that now I can stand in front of the Eiffel Tower in Paris and do a selfie of me? I am the front for the camera. I'm in the front. It is what I said about individuation and individuality and the kind of dislocation of the individual from the social, taken to, I don't know whether it's an extreme point, but a very new point in terms of the technology and what it offers. So here, the front-facing camera, I'm in front of my group of friends here, and I'm taking a selfie of myself. And I think front and back have changed meaning. Front is me now with the camera pointing this way. I am the center of the world, and the world appears behind me. Whereas with a front-facing camera, in the old-fashioned, I was here, the world was out in front of me, and the camera acted on my behalf to make a recording of that. So that is where I'm going to leave my presentation.